Good morning, everybody. Thank you again for being here. My name is Noah Klein. I'm the planner for the hazardous waste section for the Hawaii Hazardous Waste Program. And this webinar is going to be about an hour and a half this morning. We'll take a break in the middle, even though it's on the shorter side, just to make sure we're not sitting here for more than an hour without getting up. And we're going to be covering the universal waste rules in general, and then going into the new rules on aerosol cans and solar panels. So first of all, the basics. What is universal waste? It's important to understand that universal waste is a subset of hazardous waste. Okay, so when we say something is a universal waste, that doesn't mean that it's no longer hazardous waste. It means it's not subject to full hazardous waste regulation. It's subject to different regulations, which in Hawaii are chapter 11-273.1. And that's where we incorporate 40 Code of Federal Regulations, part 273. So universal waste is a subset of hazardous waste that has streamlined regulatory requirements. And another way of thinking about what is universal waste there's a list of specific types of waste that are universal waste, but it's only when those things are hazardous waste that they are universal waste. So if they don't meet the definition of hazardous waste under chapter 11-261.1 HAR, then they're not gonna be a universal waste. So these wastes are, as many of you probably know, batteries, certain pesticides. So it's recalled pesticides and unused pesticides that are managed as part of a waste pesticide collection program. Mercury containing equipment, lamps or light bulbs, electronic items, which is a state-only hazardous waste. And there are some other states that have also got something similar, but the definitions may be a little bit different. The category may be a little bit different because it's not something that's federally defined. It's something that different states have added to their universal waste programs. Aerosol cans, which is a new rule, just became effective here in Hawaii, June 7th, 2021. And solar panels, which is a new rule and is also a state-only category of universal waste. So the goals of these new rules, which are adding aerosol cans and solar panels as categories of universal waste, are to decrease the burden for managing these wastes, so hazardous waste solar panels and hazardous waste aerosol cans, properly, so decrease the burden of managing them properly, and to ensure that they're directed to proper management because they are hazardous waste, the ones that are. Second goal is to decrease the burden for making hazardous waste determinations because there are quite a variety of different aerosol cans, with different propellants and different products in them, and different solar panels with different constituents. And so it's quite a burden for the generator to have to be making a hazardous waste determination on each one. So we want to decrease that burden. And also decreasing the regulatory burden of having your generator status pushed up based only on generating things that can be managed as universal waste. So I'm sure that most of you here are on board with these goals because you're the ones who've been calling me for the past 6 months or maybe a year saying, when is this going to become effective? So yay, it's here. I hope you enjoyed the little jazz party because that's probably all the party that you're going to get about the rule. But like I said, we're going to sort of step back and go over the hazardous waste rules in general first. And then the last part of this presentation is going to focus on the rules that are specific to aerosol cans and to solar panels. So I have a whole chunk of slides here that are about universal waste as a whole, which also applies to all of those other categories: batteries, electronic items, lamps, etc. So what makes something a good candidate to be a universal waste? One is that it's going to be generated by a wide variety of generators and also a large number of generators. So it's not something that's exclusive to a specific industry. And often the kinds of things that get added as universal waste are generated both by businesses and by households. So, you know, you can think about batteries and lamps as good examples of that. The waste would be either a listed hazardous waste, or a large portion of the waste stream would be a characteristic hazardous waste. Because if it's not a hazardous waste, or if a big chunk of the waste stream isn't a hazardous waste, then it wouldn't make sense to put it under the universal waste regulatory program. It's for hazardous wastes. And then for something to be a universal waste instead of what we'll call a fully regulated hazardous waste, there has to be a relatively low risk during accumulation and transport, in terms of any exposure to that waste or any spill of that waste getting out into the environment. So, you know, when you think about different kinds of hazardous waste, and how they need to be stored and managed and transported, the risk of accumulating for a longer period of time needs to be lower for something to make sense as a candidate for universal waste. And then also adding something to the universal waste rules should be helping to divert waste from the municipal solid waste stream to recycling or to hazardous waste treatment disposal. So part of the way that works is that you have very small quantity generators and households who might be able to put this waste into the municipal solid waste stream, being encouraged to instead manage it as a universal waste. So managing it as a hazardous waste. So the overall structure of the universal waste rules, I'm gonna not quite stick to this order, but if you look at the guidebook for chapter 11-273.1, the first thing is definition and applicability. So the different types of universal waste are also listed here. So this is 40 CFR 273 subpart A. And then subparts B and C are the rules for handlers. So you have small quantity handlers of universal waste and large quantity handlers of universal waste. We'll go more into this. Transporters have their own subpart of regulation. Destination facilities, so those are the receivers who are doing the recycling or the treatment disposal. And then there's also some information about import-export, which we're not going to get too much into. And then the last part of the chapter talks about eligibility factors and petition, which is what I just sort of went over, is what makes something a good candidate to be a universal waste. So handlers includes generators of universal waste, but it's not limited to generators. So people who are collecting universal waste and just accumulating it and then shipping it on to a destination facility, or maybe even to another handler, are also generators. And the rules for, are also handlers. And the rules for those handlers are going to be the exact same rules that they are for a generator as a handler. So the universal waste handler rules are the longest section of the universal waste rules. And because of that, I want to talk a little bit about the structure internal to this portion of the rules. So basically, there are 3 different types of handler rules, or 3 different applicability of handler rules. You have rules that are only for large quantity universal waste handlers, and that are going to be different or not apply to a small quantity universal waste handler. And then you have rules that are specific to each type of universal waste. And then you have some rules that just apply to all kinds of waste and both small and large handlers. So specific to a large quantity universal waste handler are the requirement to notify and the requirement for tracking and record keeping for shipments. And we're going to go into each one of these, but just for the overall structure, I'm putting these down in the sort of order we're going to look at them. So then after that, we're going to look at the rules that apply to all handlers, which are the accumulation time limit, employee training, release response, shipment, and that's it. And then after that, there are rules for each specific type of universal waste. And these are the definition and applicability, which are not found under the handler rules. They're found in that subpart A, but they are different for each specific type of waste. And it's important to understand that when you're applying the handler rules to handling those types of wastes. So then you have waste management for each type of waste is going to be specific and different. And then also the labeling requirements. Okay, so first we're going to get into the small versus large quantity universal waste handler. So first of all, what is this? A small quantity universal waste handler accumulates less than 5,000 kilograms of universal waste at any time. So you cannot go over 5,000 kilograms. That would turn you into a large quantity handler. So it's not based on how much you generate at one time in the way that the regular hazardous waste generator status is. It's based on how much universal waste you have accumulated. And this is over all different types of universal waste added together. So a lot of generator sites might be small quantity universal waste handlers. 5,000 kilograms is kind of a lot, but because you can accumulate universal waste for up to a year, it's possible that you might generate in smaller amounts, but then accumulate over that limit. So you want to watch that. But you'll see here, there's not too much difference in what the standards are for the small and large quantity handlers. So, you know, it might be fine. You just remember that you're going to have to notify. So for a small quantity handler of universal waste, there's no requirement to notify. And this is the notification form, EPA form 8700-12. But of course, if you are generating other hazardous waste that is fully regulated and you have a generator status other than very small quantity generator, you may be required to notify based on that generator status. So it doesn't mean you're completely free of the need to notify. It just means you don't have to notify as a universal waste handler. You don't have to notify for that reason. Whereas a large quantity universal waste handler does need to notify that they're doing that. And this is important because, you know, you have those handler sites who are not generators, who are just receiving universal waste that somebody else has generated. Those are much more likely to be large quantity handlers, and they are required to notify of that activity. The other big difference is that the small quantity universal waste handler is not required to keep their shipment tracking records for 3 years, and the large quantity handler is required to. So, you know, these records can be just your regular bill of lading, you know, like your receipts. So it's not a very onerous record keeping burden. It's something that you would probably want to keep anyway, just for good business. And it's just to keep those for 3 years. So it's not a huge difference. But here's what the requirements are for the tracking and record keeping for large quantity handlers. You have a record for 3 years for shipments that you've received. And if you're just a generator, you may not be receiving anybody else's universal waste. And shipments that you're sending off. And those records need to include the name and address of the originating handler if it's waste that you're receiving, or the name and address of the destination. So the universal waste handler you're sending to, the destination facility, or the foreign destination. The quantity of each type of universal waste that's received or sent, and the date that that shipment is received or sent. So it's pretty basic. Again, this could be a log, invoice, manifest, bill of lading, movement document, or other form of shipping document. So now getting into the handler rules that are the same for small and large, and that are the same for all types of universal waste. So the first one is accumulation time limit. As I'm sure most of you know, and I already mentioned, this is 1 year. And this is, you know, one of the key sort of burden easements of universal waste, is that you can accumulate it longer. Even if you might be a large quantity generator of hazardous waste and you have your 90-day storage area and you're having to get your fully regulated hazardous waste offsite within 90 days, you can store your universal waste, accumulating it up to a year. So you need to have the accumulation start date labeled on each individual item, container, or designated accumulation area. Or you can have an inventory system that's going to track the accumulation start date by each individual item, a group, or a group of containers. Or you can use any method that clearly demonstrates the length of time that that universal waste has been accumulated from the date that it becomes a waste, or if you're receiving it from another universal waste handler, from the date that it's received onto your site. So I recommend the label method or the inventory system. If you have some other creative method you want to come up with, that's okay, but you might want to talk to us about it. It's something that you have to be able to clearly demonstrate to our inspectors if they show up on your site. So personally, I think that labeling or inventory systems are the easiest. And in most cases, just labeling, because you can label a designated accumulation area or a container. Okay, so for employee training, there is different language in the regulations for small and large quantity handlers, but I think it's very similar. So both of them are talking about training the employees in proper waste handling and emergency procedures as it relates to their responsibility. So the only real difference is in the small quantity handler, it says inform employees. And for the large quantity handler, it says ensure that all employees are thoroughly familiar with. So it's just a touch stronger, but you know, I think if there's any chance that you might accumulate over 5,000 kilograms of universal waste ever, it would just make sense to comply with ensuring. I mean, that's just good business, to ensure that your employees are familiar with what they're doing, right? I think it's a pretty easy standard to meet. So release response, the language is exactly the same. You need to immediately contain all releases of universal wastes and other residues from universal wastes. And you also need to make a hazardous waste determination on any material that results from a release or spill. And this would also include like breakage. You know, say you have like a bunch of lamps that break. And then you need to manage that appropriately. And what managing it appropriately looks like depends on what kind of waste it is and what has happened to it, right? So in the sections that are specific to different types of universal waste, it will usually tell you what you can and can't do in terms of this release response management. Okay, so for shipment of universal waste, you're only allowed to send it to another universal waste handler, a universal waste destination facility, or a foreign destination. Of course, you can also send it to a permitted TSDF, that's a hazardous waste treatment storage disposal facility that's not otherwise identified as a destination facility for universal waste, because you would just be managing it as fully regulated hazardous waste. So that sort of option to overmanage is always there. Just like even though you could store it for a year, it's perfectly fine if you want to ship it off in 90 days or 180 days, you know, based on your generator status and your already scheduled pickups for other things. That's not a problem. So the second one is that there are DOT requirements. And so this is listed here because it's actually in the hazardous waste rules that you have to comply with the DOT rules. So the DOT rules exist independently and are requirements that you have to meet, but then also in the hazardous waste rules, it says you need to do these DOT pre-packaging, pre-transportation packaging, labeling, and shipping for hazardous materials if it applies. Okay, so we'll get back to that. Whether it applies can be a little bit tricky, but that's something that you need to know for whatever type of waste you're dealing with. You also need to make sure that the receiver agrees to receive the shipment before you send it. And then if the shipment is rejected by the receiver, if you're the sender, you have to either receive the waste back or you have to agree with the original receiver on a new place to send it. And that place has to be a destination facility, even if the place you were originally sending it to was a handler. Okay, rejected and illegal shipments. So in the rules, this is also under the category of shipments. You can, as a universal waste handler, reject a shipment of universal waste that is sent to you or a portion of a shipment. And if you want to do that, you would contact the sender and let them know, and then discuss what's going to happen to it. So this is sort of the flip side of what we were just talking about. You're either going to have to send it back to the handler who sent it to you, or you're going to have to agree with them on a destination facility to send it to. And then if you receive a shipment containing hazardous waste that is not universal waste, you need to notify immediately the State Department of Health, and specifically that's the Hazardous Waste Program. If that were to ever happen, the best number to call would be 586-4226, which is the main phone number for the solid and hazardous waste branch. Okay, so for waste management, it's going to be specific to each type of universal waste. And no treatment is allowed except for the things that qualify as treatment that are listed in the waste management section for handlers for that specific type of waste. So to give you an example of this, for batteries in the waste management section, this is exactly the same for small and large handlers of universal waste. It says that handlers are allowed to do these things: sorting batteries by type, mixing battery types in one container, discharging batteries so as to remove the electric charge, regenerating used batteries, disassembling batteries or battery packs into individual batteries or cells, removing batteries from consumer products, or removing electrolyte from batteries. So as a handler, you can do those things, but you can't do anything else that would count as treatment. Okay, so moving on to transporters. The transporter rules are pretty short. I do want to note here that handlers are allowed to self-transport universal waste, but if you do that, then you are subject to the transporter rules. So you would also, as a handler, need to be following these transporter requirements. So first of all, we have restrictions. You can only, as a transporter, deliver universal waste to the places that handlers are allowed to send it. So that's to another universal waste handler, a universal waste destination facility, or a foreign destination. You can store for up to 10 days as a transporter. If you store for longer than 10 days, that makes you a handler, and then you need to follow all of the handler rules. So that's, the accumulation, labeling, all of that, just as a handler. If you're under the 10-day limit, then you don't have the same requirements for storage. It's just going to be like already in that pre-transportation packaging labeling, and that's basically it. You're also prohibited from diluting or treating universal waste except by responding to releases. So as a transporter, you cannot do any of those treatment management things that are listed for handlers, unless you want to be a handler and follow all of the handler rules. Oh, I already said that. Okay, so for transporters, the DOT packaging and labeling is going to be a very important part of what you're doing. And again, these are DOT requirements that exist independently, but are referred to in the hazardous waste rules. So if the universal waste meets the definition of a hazardous material in 49 CFR 171.8, then you have to follow the applicable DOT requirements. So one of the big differences between fully regulated hazardous waste and universal waste is that the universal waste does not automatically meet this definition. So fully regulated hazardous waste that has to go on a uniform hazardous waste manifest is DOT hazardous material, just by definition. But universal waste is not automatically, because it does not require the uniform hazardous waste manifest to ship it. And so this is sort of the flip side of that, is that you cannot describe universal waste by the DOT proper shipping name, hazardous waste, liquid or solid, not otherwise specified. And you cannot describe it just by adding waste to that hazardous materials proper shipping name. But on the other hand, some universal waste may still meet the criteria for other hazard classes besides just being like a hazardous waste that requires a manifest. So those of you on the line who are transporters probably know a lot more about this than I do. I'm not that familiar with the DOT rules. But I think for people that this applies to, you probably already know all of this. So release response, this is exactly the same as for a handler: immediately contain, clean it up, make a hazardous waste determination, and then based on that determination, you're going to manage it. If it's a hazardous waste, you're going to manage it as a hazardous waste. Tracking and record keeping. This is the same as for a large quantity universal waste handler. It's 3 years of records, just the basics, name and address. And so it's for shipments that you, well, I guess you're picking them up and you're dropping them off, but you have to have the name and address for both where it's shipping from and where it's shipping to, the quantity and the date, both the date that you picked it up and the date that you delivered it. So pretty simple, pretty clear. Again, it can be a log, invoice, manifest, bill of lading, movement document, or other shipping document. So moving on to destination facilities. The first and most important thing to know about a universal waste destination facility is that it is a RCRA treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So it does require a TSDF permit. And if you're interested in learning more about the permitting, the information is in chapter 11-270.1 Hawaii Administrative Rules, and also a hazardous waste destination facility, sometimes that word just escapes my brain, is subject to the TSDF requirements in chapter 11-264.1. And those are the requirements for all permitted TSDFs. So not too much to say here, because I don't expect anybody is running one of these or wanting to. But if you do want to, definitely call us, because the permit process is not a quick and easy process. So tracking and record keeping for the destination facility is the same as it is for the handler and the transporter. Again, this is only for a large quantity handler. But yep, same requirement. You're only receiving things as a destination facility. And it's just name and address, quantity of each type of universal waste, and the date of receipt. And rejected and illegal shipments, this is the same as for a handler. If you're a destination facility receiving, you can reject a shipment and you would contact the sender to let them know either you're going to send it back to the shipper or you're going to send it to a different destination facility. And the same deal if a destination facility receives hazardous waste that is not universal waste, that is illegal, and they would need to immediately notify our department to let us know, who is shipping this to you illegally, what's going on. Yeah, so that is the end of the destination facility requirements. Very simple. I do see a question in the chat, so I'm going to answer that quick. The question is if lead acid batteries, sorry, in the Q&A, please use the Q&A, not the chat. If lead acid batteries are being managed under 11-266 for specific hazardous waste, so that's referring to chapter 11-266.1 in the Hawaii Administrative Rules. Is the quantity exempt from being added to the total weight under the universal waste rules? So that's a very good question. In Hawaii, we actually amended that portion of the incorporated federal rules to point back to the universal waste rules. So lead acid batteries are managed as universal waste under chapter 11-273.1, just like all other batteries. And so they are going to count towards that total of accumulated universal waste. Okay, so that went by pretty quick, but I'm still going to declare a break time anyway. Welcome back. Before we go forward, I'm going to answer another great question that somebody put in on batteries. And the question is, if the batteries are reclaimed, are they considered waste? So the short answer is yes, they are still waste, but they can actually be managed differently than the batteries that are not reclaimed. So I want to show you our rules page. This is one of those things where there's just always exceptions, right? So I just said lead acid batteries are managed under 273.1. But I'm going to go to the guidebook here for chapter 11-266.1 to the section on lead acid batteries, and you'll see, so this is the guidebook with track changes showing the differences from the federal rules. So this whole section was changed. And so specifically for lead acid batteries, it says persons who generate, transport, collect, or store spent batteries that will be reclaimed but do not reclaim them are subject to regulation under 273.1. Owners and operators of facilities that reclaim spent acid batteries on site are subject to the following requirements. So if you're actually the one who's doing the reclaiming, there's a different set of requirements. You're not acting as a universal waste destination facility. But that is specific to lead acid batteries. So they are a waste if they're being reclaimed, but for lead acid batteries, there's a slight variation in the rules. So thank you for that question that reminded me of that. I think I can just close this. Yes, that will take us back to the slides. So get here. Now I can control them again. Yes. So we will move on to talking about the rules that are specific to each type of waste. And we're only going to cover the aerosol cans and solar panels here. But if you have questions about other types of universal waste, you can ask them, and I will try to answer as many as I can at the end. And you can always call or email me. I'm just going to check the chat. Okay, somebody is just saying they have to take off and that they're hoping to look at the recording, which is a good reminder for me to let you know that this is being recorded and will be posted on the website. So on the rules page, I posted the webinar from last week about the pharmaceuticals rule, and I will also be posting this one. So you'll scroll down past the table that has all of the rule chapters and guidebooks, and then that's where the recording will be posted with the other information about the rule update. Okay, so rules specific to each type of waste. So again, just a reminder of the framework. We have the definitions and applicability that are going to be specific for each type of waste. And then we have waste management and labeling. So for aerosol cans, the aerosol can definition is fairly simple. It means a non-refillable receptacle containing a gas that is compressed, liquefied, or dissolved under pressure, and the sole purpose of which is to expel a liquid, paste, or powder, and fitted with a self-closing release device that allows the contents to be ejected by the gas. So an aerosol can is an aerosol can. I think we all know what those are. But you have other compressed gas cylinders that are refillable that are not aerosol cans. I think that's the main message here. So for applicability, the way that the universal waste rules are structured, you always have to look at the definition for the type of waste and the applicability section for that type of waste in order to fully understand what is and isn't regulated. So for aerosol cans, the applicability section says these specific aerosol cans are not covered under this chapter. So they're not covered under universal waste. Aerosol cans that are not yet waste. So if it's not a waste, it can't be a hazardous waste, and so it can't be a universal waste, right? And that's a whole in-depth discussion about when is something a waste that we're not going to go into today, but if you have questions, let me know. Also, aerosol cans that are not hazardous waste are not universal waste. That doesn't mean you can't manage them as universal waste, because you can, and we encourage that over management. This is where the decrease in a regulatory burden comes in, is that you don't have to make a hazardous waste determination on each aerosol can if you simply manage all of them as if they are hazardous waste, which means you're going to manage them as universal waste. Also, aerosol cans that meet the standard for empty containers, which is under section 40 CFR 261.7, as that is incorporated and amended in the Hawaii rules. And that's in chapter 11-261.1. If it's empty, then it's not going to be a hazardous waste. And so it's not going to be universal waste. But again, you can overmanage. So just to sort of expand on that a little bit, aerosol cans can be hazardous for a number of different reasons. They could be hazardous because of the properties of the propellant, the properties of the product that's, that the propellant is there to expel from the can, or simply because they're pressurized. So it is difficult to determine if a specific aerosol can is or is not a hazardous waste. And that's part of the reason that EPA decided that it would make good sense for aerosol cans to be universal waste, is so that generators don't have to worry about making an individual hazardous waste determination on each aerosol can. So for aerosol cans, management to prevent releases, that's the first requirement of how you manage them as a handler, is that you're managing them to prevent releases. So the way that you do that is you're going to accumulate them in a container that is structurally sound, compatible with the contents of the aerosol cans, lacks evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage, and is protected from sources of heat. And so I try not to put too many words on a slide, and I cut out the part where it says lacks evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage that could cause leakage under reasonably foreseeable conditions. So this language probably is familiar to you. It appears in many places. I believe that the container standards for all hazardous waste have this same language in them. So it's nothing out of the ordinary. Just you have to have a container with structural integrity. The protected from sources of heat is something that is specific to aerosol cans. And that's because they can be much more dangerous because of the pressurized gas at a higher temperature. So that means that your container where you're accumulating aerosol cans probably cannot be outside in Hawaii, because we have this great source of heat called the sun. And I think that, it's arguable perhaps, but I would suggest to you that is not protecting from sources of heat if your container is sitting outdoors in this climate. So any aerosol can that shows evidence of leakage must be packaged into a separate closed container or overpacked with absorbents, or immediately punctured and drained. And we're going to talk more about how you puncture and drain. So this universal waste rule for aerosol cans does allow puncturing and draining, but there are a whole specific set of conditions that you have to follow in how you do that. So here's the list of management/treatment things that you're allowed to do. A handler can sort aerosol cans by type, mix intact aerosol cans in one container, so you can sort them or not sort them. You're allowed to remove the actuators to reduce the risk of accidental release. Now, you're not required to do this. You're just allowed to do this. And you can also puncture and drain with a bunch of conditions. So here's what those conditions are. You have to recycle the punctured aerosol can once it is empty. So the way this is written in the rules is a little bit confusing because this isn't actually in the list. It's in the introductory paragraph to the list of the conditions, but it is actually a condition that you have to meet if you're going to puncture and drain, is that you recycle the empty cans. You have to use a device that is designed specifically in order to safely puncture aerosol cans and to effectively contain the residual contents and emissions from that process. You have to have and follow a written procedure for safe puncture and drain. And you have to have a copy of the manufacturer's specifications and instructions for your puncturing device on site, and train employees that are operating the device in how to do that properly. And then you also have to do your puncture and drain procedure in a way that is designed to prevent fires and to prevent release to the environment. And one of the specific ways to do this that is written into the rules is that the equipment has to be on a solid flat surface in a well-ventilated area. That is not the only thing you have to do to prevent fires and releases, but it is one that you definitely have to do. You also need to immediately transfer the contents from the aerosol can or from the puncturing device if the device is collecting the contents to a container or a tank that meets the requirements of one of these sections. And so these are the very small quantity generator accumulation rules, the small and large quantity generator accumulation rules in 16 and 17, and then the satellite accumulation area rules in section 15. So most of you are probably familiar with these sections, or if the section numbers don't look familiar to you, that's because this section numbering is relatively new from when we adopted the generator improvements rule. So these are new section numberings in the federal rules that have been incorporated into the Hawaii administrative rules. So all of these sections are incorporated and amended in chapter 11-262.1, which is the generator requirements. So again, it's transfer the contents of the aerosol can into a container or tank that meets these requirements. And so these are the same kind of basic, structural integrity and safety of storing it in a container or tank requirements. And then you also need to make a hazardous waste determination on the contents that you've emptied out of the aerosol can. And if those are a hazardous waste, then you need to manage them as a hazardous waste. And then if they're not a hazardous waste, you're going to manage them in accordance with solid waste rules. And you also need to have a written procedure for a spill or leak and have a spill cleanup kit. And if you have a spill or leak, you need to clean it up promptly. And that's the end of the conditions about how to puncture and drain to prevent releases that allows you to do puncture and drain. I just want to note that we did make one change in the language of the federal rule in incorporating it into the Hawaii rules. And that is just on the point about if it's not a hazardous waste. So in the Hawaii rules, it reads, if the contents are determined to be non-hazardous, manage them in compliance with applicable federal, state, and local solid waste regulations. And then for labeling, for aerosol cans, you only have two options. So one is that you label each individual aerosol can. That seems a little tedious. The second option is that you label each container in which aerosol cans are contained. So since the management standards require you to contain them anyway in a container, I would suggest you're going to want to label each container. And then for actually what the label says, there are 6 options: universal waste aerosol can, or universal waste aerosol cans. And then likewise, with and without an S, waste aerosol can, cans, used aerosol can, or cans. So it seems a little nitpicky, but those are the only 6 options for labeling them correctly. Okay, so we're gonna take a pause here for questions that are specific to aerosol cans. And I do have 1 or 2 here. Let's see. Do punctured cans have to be managed as universal waste? The punctured cans have to be recycled. So I guess they're actually being managed as scrap metal there, but that is part of how you would manage a universal waste aerosol can that is punctured and drained, is you have to recycle the empty can. I'm not sure if that answers the question or if you're trying to ask something else, but if it doesn't, maybe you can try rephrasing. Okay, for clarification, if an aerosol can, which formerly contained a hazardous characteristic propellant but is now empty or at atmospheric pressure per 261.7 and not punctured for recycling, is it exempt from, and then here it says 261.1 rules, but I think what you mean is, does it have to be managed as a universal waste, or can it just be managed as a solid waste because it's not hazardous? So if it meets the definition of empty, then it can just be managed as a solid waste because it can't be a hazardous waste. It can't be a universal waste if it's not a hazardous waste, right? Because all universal wastes are hazardous wastes. And that's where that applicability section comes in and sort of mingles with the definition, because it's only an aerosol can that meets the definition of a hazardous waste in chapter 11-261.1 that would be covered as a universal waste aerosol can. If it's not a hazardous waste, then it can't be a universal waste, but you can still overmanage it as a universal waste if you choose to, because that might just be much easier than having to make a determination on each of your aerosol cans. Hopefully that answers that question. And then somebody else asked, what can we do with aerosol cans that are empty, like the canned air that is used to clean electronics/keyboards, or spray paint that is all used up? So if it does meet the definition of empty, then you're okay to manage it as solid waste. But it can be a little bit tricky because there might be propellant still in there, even though there's no product, or there might be product but no propellant, or maybe the actuator breaks off and there's still product in there. And so I recommend just managing it as a universal waste, particularly if you have other aerosol cans that you're already managing as a universal waste. And that's sort of part of how the universal waste rules work, is to really encourage over management. But if it does meet the definition of empty, then you don't have to manage it as a hazardous waste. Okay, does the whole process and including waste disposal have to be managed as universal waste? If you are a very small quantity generator, you can store the waste longer if it is not a universal waste. Right, question mark. Okay, so this is a great question, and it's a little bit tricky to answer because to truly be a VSQG, meaning you're not required to manage, you're not required to send your hazardous waste to a hazardous waste TSDF. You would have to be counting all of the waste that you're generating that's hazardous, including universal waste, and still be under 220 pounds per month that you're generating. If you're only a VSQG because you're not counting the universal wastes, but if you count them, you would be over that, then you are required to manage them as universal waste, because essentially your actual generation is an SQG amount, and then you only drop down to VSQG by taking those universal wastes out of the count. You would have to manage them as universal waste. You're not allowed to manage them like a solid waste. Trying to make sure I'm understanding this question right. So a very small quantity generator does not have an accumulation time limit for their hazardous waste. So it's true that you could be accumulating for longer than a year for your fully regulated, or it wouldn't be fully regulated because you're the SQG. Complicated. But if the universal waste would put you over 220 pounds a month, then yes, you only have a year to accumulate the universal waste. If it wouldn't put you over, then you could manage it as you manage all of your hazardous waste. It's a very good question. I might need more details. So if you want to email me about your specific situation, I think it might be worth going more into detail on that. Okay, the retain accumulated from aerosol puncture is D001 and F code RCRA waste with an accumulation date goes off island to a TSDF. I think you're asking about like the liquid that has drained from the punctured aerosol cans. So if it is D001 and it's an F code waste, if that's what you have that you're draining, then yes, your hazardous waste determination would be this is hazardous, and we're going to manage this as a fully regulated RCRA hazardous waste. It's going to be shipped off to a hazardous waste TSDF on the mainland. That's correct. To clarify, if we have 20-pound battery manages universal waste, that 20 pounds goes toward our 220-pound hazardous waste limit for the month. Okay, so this is a different person asking, but it's getting at this same question about when are you totally a VSQG and when do you have to manage things as universal waste. So if you're managing your battery as universal waste, then you don't count it toward that generator status. So like if you have 210 pounds of other waste and then you have a battery that's 20 pounds, you would manage that battery as universal waste, and then you would remain a very small quantity generator for your other waste because you're still under 220 pounds. Hopefully that makes sense. Excellent questions, keep them coming. We're going to move on to solar panels, but you can put your questions in the Q&A at any time, and we are going to have plenty of time at the end for more. Okay, solar panels. So the definition that we've put into the state rules for this is a solar panel or solar photovoltaic panel means a device consisting of one or more electrically connected photovoltaic cells that are designed to convert solar radiation into electrical energy. So this includes integrated components that cannot be separated without breaking the solar panel glass. And then photovoltaic cells that are not electrically connected are kind of included. So I put a little star here. They're not really included in the definition of solar panel, but in the definition of photovoltaic cell, it says photovoltaic cells that are not electrically connected are managed as solar panels. So they're managed the same way as a solar panel. It does not include solar thermal panels that do not contain photovoltaic cells. So the PV cells are the part that will make a solar panel hazardous, and they are sort of the definitive thing to the type of solar panel that we are including as a universal waste. So a solar thermal panel that's just a bunch of piping basically that the hot water runs through is a very, very different type of panel. And that's not included in the solar panel definition. So a photovoltaic cell is a specialized semiconductor diode that's designed to convert solar radiation into electrical energy. And then in the definition, it gives some examples of the types of PV cells that are out there, but it's including but not limited to these different types of cells. And then, as we've already discussed, the definition and the applicability section for each type of universal waste really work together. So for the solar panels, this applicability section is a little bit more complex. And we based this, by the way, off of California's universal waste solar panel rule. So solar panels that would not be covered as universal wastes are solar panels that are not yet wastes. Solar panels that were previously identified as wastes but are no longer identified as wastes. So if it's been refurbished or returned to service, then it's not a waste. Solar panels that are not identified as hazardous waste, as we've already discussed sort of ad nauseum, and I apologize for this repetition, but if it's not a hazardous waste, it can't be a universal waste. However, you are welcome to overmanage so you don't have to worry about making that hazardous waste determination. And then solar panels that are integrated into the structure of an electronic item are to be managed under the electronic item universal waste rules instead of under the solar panel rules. We also have a list of solar panels not covered as universal waste because they still have to be managed as fully regulated hazardous waste. So that would be solar panels that exhibit a characteristic of hazardous waste other than the characteristic of toxicity. I don't expect that these exist, but should they exist in the future, you know, if you have a solar panel that is somehow meeting the definition of the corrosivity characteristic, that cannot be managed as a universal waste. And then solar panels recycled in a manner constituting disposal. So for instance, you cannot decide that you're going to tile your outdoor patio area with used solar panels by just putting them down over the dirt. That would be recycling in a manner constituting disposal. Not allowed. So what makes it hazardous? It's kind of the same deal as with the aerosol cans. There are so many different types of solar panels, and the technologies have changed over time. It's tough to know what exactly is in a given solar panel, but there are, you know, different metals So silicon, cadmium, copper, all these different things. So it's mainly like rare earth metals that are, so the reason it makes sense to create a category of universal waste is because we have a big chunk of the waste stream that is going to meet the toxicity characteristic definition of hazardous waste. So management standards for solar panels, again, are based on managing to prevent releases. So store in a manner that prevents breakage and release under reasonably foreseeable conditions. An intact solar panel does not need to be contained in order to meet this standard. So we've written this into the rules just to try to make rules that are reasonable. Solar panels are designed to be outside. They're designed to be self-contained. And so as long as it's intact, it's not going to leak the nasty hazardous parts of it out. And it doesn't need another container around it in order to be managed safely. But if you do have evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage that could cause leakage under reasonably foreseeable conditions, then you have to immediately clean that up and containerize it. And the container needs to be closed, structurally sound, compatible with the contents, and lack evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage. And that's, again, under reasonably foreseeable conditions. Other language here that I cut out from the slide, just to be aware, there is a little more language in the rules. A container or other method of storage, e.g. stretch film wrapped panels on a pallet used, so other method of storage used, must prevent breakage, leakage, spillage, or damage that could cause leakage under reasonably foreseeable conditions. So the suggestion of stretch film wrapping them on a pallet is an example of where they're not inside of a container, but they're being managed in a way that's designed to prevent damage. So it's like you can't just lean them against a wall. That's probably not good enough because they could get knocked over. Okay, so management to prevent releases. Here are the things that you can do, again, that would constitute treatment, but that are allowed for handlers of universal waste. And by the way, these are all going to be the same for a small and large quantity handler of universal waste. And that's true for, I believe, all of the different types of universal waste. So for solar panels, you can sort them by type, or you can mix different types together in one container, on one pallet, or in a demarcated storage area. You're also allowed to remove ancillary components that are typically removed for replacement during the normal operation and maintenance of a solar system. And that removal of components would need to be done as prescribed in the operating manual for that system, or in a manner that would otherwise reasonably be employed during normal operation and maintenance. And you do have to make a hazardous waste determination on any new resulting waste, right? So you're taking it apart into pieces, and then basically it's like each piece becomes its separate waste now, and you have to make a hazardous waste determination on that and then manage it appropriately. So examples of ancillary components that you might be able to remove are things like connectors, junction boxes, batteries, and inverters. So if you removed a battery, that becomes a separate waste and you make a determination on it, you're just going to manage it as a universal waste battery, right? Let's see, I'm going to make sure I've covered all the fine points that I took out of the slide. Okay, so yeah, it specifically says in the rules, if the waste that you're generating by doing this activity is another type of universal waste, it can be managed as a universal waste. The handler, who's doing this removal of components is the generator. and is subject to Chapter 11-262.1. And if the waste is not hazardous, then you're going to manage it in compliance with solid waste regulations. If it is hazardous, you're going to manage it under Chapter 11-262.1. Unless it's universal waste, you can manage as a universal waste. Labeling. So you can label each solar panel, each container or pallet containing solar panels, or each designated universal waste solar panel storage area that is demarcated by boundaries. So we did get very specific here, and the reason for that is because we're sort of breaking new ground on allowing the labeling of the designated area. So it does have to be demarcated by boundaries very clearly, so that you can just put one label there instead of having to label each pallet, each container, or each panel. And then similar to the aerosol cans, you've got 6 options for what that language on the label looks like. And here they are. So I see one question. Are solar cells that power lights considered universal waste? I think you're thinking of those like little garden lights that you stick in the ground. And I would say, yeah, the solar panel on there probably is hazardous. I mean, that you'd have to take the whole item and grind it down and T-clip it to find out if it was really a hazardous waste. But I think odds are, because it's a small item, there might be enough of those metals to make it hazardous. So again, this is part of the idea of a universal waste rule, is that you're gonna overmanage so that you don't have to worry about making that hazardous waste determination. Oh yeah, that's the last slide. So if you have more questions, please type them into the chat. Here's my email address so that you can email me if you have other questions. So what about solar panels built into a backpack to charge cell phones or other devices? That is such a very excellent question. I think that consumer products like that are probably less likely to be generated by a business. So hopefully this doesn't become a huge issue. I don't have a good answer for you. I think that's a great question. And I'm just going to leave it there. Do operable solar panels being stored for future use need to be labeled? I would say that sounds like they're not a waste. So that would mean they're not regulated and wouldn't have to be labeled. That said, if your site also is generating waste panels, you wouldn't want to be storing them in the same area as these. Like if an inspector walked in there, you would want it to be really clear from the way that they were stored that you were storing them for future use. You know, I would label them as these ones are still good so that I would not get confused myself. But as long as you can show the inspector that they are not yet a waste, they wouldn't be regulated. How does breaking the glass of a solar panel affect its universal waste status? That's a great question. So if the glass is broken accidentally, then that panel can still be managed as a universal waste. Let me go back a couple slides here. So the second bullet here, immediately clean up and place in a container any universal waste solar panel that shows evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage that could cause leakage under reasonably foreseeable conditions. This would be your accidentally broken panel. Basically, you're going to containerize it and you can still manage it as a universal waste. Now, that said, you are not allowed as a universal waste handler to break the glass on purpose. right? Because the only things that you're allowed to do are these things. And it does not say here that you can break the glass. So if you were to purposefully break the glass, you would be acting as a destination facility. You would be treating without a permit. And that is a very bad thing. So don't do that. Does the processor of the solar panel on the mainland have to have an R2 certification? That is a good question. And I would say the quick answer is no. What they do have to have is a TSDF permit, because they would be acting as a destination facility for universal waste. It might be likely that they would also have that R2 certification. But what they have to have under the regulations would be that RCRA permit. Our broken, smashed panels are considered RCRA metal codes outside of intact universal waste panels. I'm not exactly sure what the question is here. So, you have the same kind of difficulty making a hazardous waste determination on a panel, I think, whether it's intact or broken. I would assume that it's hazardous unless I had good evidence otherwise, just because there are so many different kinds of panels. I do think that the newer panels are starting to come out with different materials, and maybe somebody's gonna make technology where it won't be hazardous. But a lot of the panels that we're going to be dealing with as waste are the ones that have been already in use for 25 or 30 years, that have the older technologies and are probably even more likely to be hazardous. Okay, another question. TSDF permit, explain how to get this permit as shipping is expensive. Okay, you're definitely going to want to call my office. So it says as shipping is expensive and we need to consolidate for shipping. So if you want to act as a handler who's not a generator and you want to receive universal waste from other sites and then consolidate it and ship it to a facility on the mainland that's going to be the TSDF, you don't need a permit to do that. That would be acting as a large quantity universal waste handler. But if you actually want to become the recycler who's going to, take the panels apart, extract the metals, all of that, that is what you would need the permit for. And if somebody on the line is interested in trying to start that kind of business in the state of Hawaii, please call my office. We need to talk. How to get this permit is a pretty complex process and it does take time, and you need to talk to us. So there's an application, and we would have some meetings, and there's a lot that is specific to what you want to do. So I will go back to the end slide that's got my email address on it, and then just repeat that the main phone number for the solid and hazardous waste branch is 586-4226. And so you would probably, you could ask for me. You could ask for Noah and you'll get me. Or just send me an email, but we're definitely going to talk to my boss too. This is something that you want to do. Okay, I've got nothing else in the Q&A except for thank yous. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and end this. And I will try to have it posted online early next week.